Good afternoon, everyone. I believe we are now live, and we're just bringing people in, and we're going to get ready to start with today's webinar. So please do bear with us as we bring people in. Thank you for waiting for us. As you're coming in from the waiting room, I'll do the welcome and the introductions. So I'm Ugo Ikoku. I'm a grants manager at Trust for London. I'm also a trustee and the treasurer for London Funders, and it's great to have you with us this afternoon. That said, I will also be your chair for this afternoon's session. So over March and April, we've been hosting a three-part webinar series to kind of mark 2 years since lockdown started. And through these series, we've been looking back on the foundations we need to build on, upon which, the things we had in place before the pandemic, what we've learned over the last 2 years. And this is the third session in this trilogy. And as trilogies go, hopefully it promises to be very exciting. For those of you who are Marvel fans, you will understand what I mean. So for this third session, we'll be thinking about what we need to do together for the future, and just sharing how we use the lessons from our response as funders to the pandemic to help shape long-term funder collaboration and to support London's communities beyond the pandemic. Many of you will know, as funders actively engaged in London's communities, many of us are acutely aware that the demand for civil society and community groups, as well as the structural inequalities that we've been working to tackle in London, they existed before the pandemic. And since then, they've been exacerbated and they've increased. Here at London Funders, we've also been exploring how our shared learning from the crisis can be applied to funder collaboration for longer term recovery. We've been able to use the feedback and the insights from our members and civil society to help inform some focus group discussions with a cross section of our members, as well as our equity partners as well. And this has led to the development of proposals for collaborative action for recovery. And so really for us, building from this statement, we've developed a proposal for what we think collaborative action for recovery could look like. My colleague Marlene will post that. It's available on our website, and I believe the link will be posted on the chat as well. And so really we're looking forward to continuing to work with our members and our partners from across London to try and turn some of these ideas into actions. So if you do want to join us on this journey towards future funder collaboration, then do please get in touch with the London Funders team. So over the next 80 minutes or so, we'll be discussing how as funders we can continue to collaborate at pace and scale. We know it's possible, we've seen it done. We'll discuss some of the challenges that London faces, from systemic inequalities to climate crisis, and just, what is required really in terms of the same innovative and bold action that, we displayed during the pandemic. I'm really excited because we're not alone this afternoon. We're joined by a really lovely stellar panel who will also be sharing their reflections. They'll be taking your questions, and really we'll be having a good discussion to try and understand what is required to build that long-term funder collaboration that is fit for tackling the issues that London faces. Just also say that today's session is being recorded, and we'll make that available for anyone who's unable to join us today. And during the discussion, any resources that we refer to would also be posted in the chat. So please do keep your eye out on that. You'll also notice that as it's a webinar, the format is slightly different in that, we can't see your lovely and smiley faces today, especially as the weather's so lovely as well. We can't also see your raised hands. So if you do have any questions, please post that in the Q&A box and I'll pick it up during the discussion. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome and screen with me Sam Grimmett-Batt. Sam is funding director at City Bridge Trust, and as funding director, Sam manages and leads a team of funding managers at City Bridge Trust. Sam also oversees funding programs and strategic pieces of work and builds relationships within and across the sector. I thought it was interesting to also add that Sam is also a committee member at the Grant Funders Network and has worked in the sector for more than a decade. So comes with a wealth of experience gained across the sector. It's lovely to see you, Sam. Welcome. And alongside Sam is Tracy Lazard. Tracy is CEO for Inclusion London. Tracy is a disabled person with 23 years of experience working in a variety of deaf and disabled people's organizations. I'll refer to them as DDPOs, where she has promoted disability equality, user involvement, and the social model of disability, as well as the cultural model of deafness. She's been in CEO positions for the last 16 years. She joined Inclusion London team as chief executive back in 2011. And Tracy is really, really passionate about the value and the contribution that DDPOs make to both equality and inclusion, but also in terms of delivering effective, accessible, and holistic services that really make a difference to deaf and disabled people's lives. So welcome, Tracy. Again, it's lovely to see you here. And finally, last but not the least, making up the full complement for today's discussion is Alistair Wilson. Alistair has been the chief executive of the School for Social Entrepreneurs. I've, heard, been familiar with the School of Social Entrepreneurs for some time. And so Alistair has been the CEO since 2003. SSE has grown into a national and international network, supporting over 1,000 plus people a year, helping to develop the skills, the strengths, and the networks that they need to tackle society's biggest problems. Alistair is also the pioneer of the Match Trading, which is a program designed to support the trading resilience of social enterprises. You can find out more detail on the SSE website. He's also co-founder of Tonic Housing, which is the UK's first LGBT retirement community. Alistair, it's lovely to have you with us as well on this panel. So I'm going to start by asking each of our panel members to just summarize their reflections on key lessons around funder collaboration during the pandemic. Sam, if I can start with you, and then we can take it from there.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for that very generous introduction. So at City Bridge Trust, we, during the pandemic, we were part of the London Community Response Funder Collaboration, where London funders convened over 60 funders who came together to fund emergency response work across the lockdowns. We ran a pooled fund during that time, which collected donations from about 20 funders, and during the course of all of the lockdowns, we distributed about £30 million to charities across the sector. I think that some of the key learning pieces for me, really, I think the biggest one for me is that we couldn't have done what we did without the unifying principles, the 8 principles that we agreed right at the start together, that we wanted to try to run the whole program according to, and we met some of them better than we met others, but having the principles as a unifying factor, it really set the tone, and it helped to set the culture of the way that we were going to work together and try and work together in a new way, and to try and do things in a more non-hierarchical way. I think the other thing is that the collaboration supported us to work with, to extend the reach of our work beyond the usual suspects. And I mean that in terms of funders that we worked with, and I also mean that in terms of the organisations that we supported through the funding, but also through collaboration with organisations that were not themselves funders, but which became part of the design process. And they kind of became known as the Equity Crew, which was a self-dubbed name, I think. I hope Tracy will back me up on saying that, because I wouldn't use it otherwise. But they were a group of 4 organisations representing various protected characteristic communities. And they helped us from a very early stage to kind of design the programme and review how we were awarding the funding as we went. It helped us to involve communities more in the priorities and the design. It helped us to think about our learning in a different way as we were going through the collaboration. And at City Bridge Trust, certainly it's led to us embedding some much different ways of working and launching some new pieces of work that are continuing working in those ways. So I suppose the final takeaway for me is that it really did demonstrate that we can be greater than the sum of our parts when we work together in that way, and the ends do justify the means. It was difficult, and some of the things that we did during the lockdowns wouldn't be possible and wouldn't be sensible or ethical to try and do now in a non-emergency context, because they involved lots of people volunteering their time and lots of working in the evenings and things like that. But it showed us what's achievable when we come together. So I suppose those are my key takeaways.
Thank you, Sam. That's really useful. I just want to come back to, before I go to Tracy and I want to come back to the 8 unifying principles that you talked about. Could you just kind of expand a bit more? And I'm really curious as to what was it about those principles that, in a sense, helped to bring. I mean, we've talked about this for years. The sort of fragmentation within the sector as a whole. But it's interesting that it took, obviously, crisis of this nature and this size to get us to come to that point. But what was it about those principles, and how did we even arrive at those principles in the first place?
So I think that in many ways it was work that London funders had done prior to the lockdowns that helped the funders who were working together in those early stages to draft those principles, because it was very much based around the kind of possible, not the perfect principles of, what would be the blue sky thinking here? What would we really love to achieve if we could? Let's start out from that place and then see where it takes us. And all credit to London funders, because really they were the ones who were holding the pen on that, and that was allowing the funders to come to it with an open mind and hopefully flexibility. The other thing that kind of made it possible, I would say, is that we had a neutral body. So London funders were neutral. They were not themselves a funder. So there was something about the politics of having an organisation that was more neutral at the centre of it. And in terms of what did it, you didn't ask this question, but there was also something around, it meant that the group that was meeting to kind of decide the strategy had some coat hooks to hang their thinking on, and that we could always come back to these 8 principles and say, well, is what we're talking about here, is it living up to these principles that we set at the beginning? So it supported some of the pace and some of the decision making that had to be done much faster than normal.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll probably come back to this at the end, and I think just picking up on the last point you made, just about how we think about this going forward, and how potentially it would be unethical to consider doing some of the things that we did, obviously. But it's interesting, because oftentimes the sort of the gravitational pull towards old ways of working will be strong, especially as we, as trust and foundations, and some foundations grapple with the impact of, if you like, the economic downturn on their own endowments. But yeah, we'll pick up later on some of the practices that have emerged, and how we expand and formalize some of those, and just, as you said, maybe leave some of the other ones that potentially don't live up to the kind of values, the ethics, and the that we want to see. So, Tracy, if I can just ask you as well to just jump in and maybe picking up on some of what Sam said and potentially just also expanding on, what you see as your reflections from the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. I was representing Inclusion London, and alongside the LGBTQI Consortium and the Women's Resource Centre and the Belly Foundation, we did make up the equity crew. I don't know where that term came from, but we're fine with it. We quite like it. So I guess, my kind of reflections come from that work. And I think there's a lot of really positive learning to kind of build on from that. So what the equity crew organisations were there to do, we had two kind of key roles. And I think it was really important that kind of alongside and similar to kind of building in the principles of the funding, I think kind of our roles were kind of very clear and kind of embedded, maybe not right from the beginning, but very early on in the process. So we played two roles. We had a critical kind of friend role to the actual development of the funding programme. So that's everything from looking at the kind of the goals, the strategy, but also the process and the communication. And really, really interesting stuff came out of that. And the other thing that we did, which is kind of, I felt almost like a really positive pincer movement, was that we were also funded as equity infrastructure organisations to actually work with members that we know would experience barriers accessing the funding programme. So we did a lot of outreach work with our organisations, supporting them to know about the fund, apply to the fund, and then actually some really kind of practical ongoing work with the sifters and the kind of funding panels in the process, which again was really informative. I think some of the key kind of really positives was that kind of designed and intentional collaboration from the outset. We didn't have to kind of knock on the door halfway through the process and already then be in a position of kind of just, I guess, kind of flagging up stuff that hadn't been done. We could be part of the design and the implementation. And I think kind of one of the really positive things was just being able to be resourced to actually work with other equity infrastructure organisations. We were funded for this role, and that enabled this work to happen. And it was really great to kind of meet together and realise that a lot of the issues that our kind of individual communities had were shared, because the experience of kind of systemic structural inequality is there across all of the communities that we represent. So there's a real kind of, it really grew our kind of collaborative working and our kind of confidence, I think, in asserting what we thought should be some of the kind of priorities of the fund. I think for me, that kind of process showed more than ever that we have to be explicit in tackling structural inequality. Even in a pandemic, we were getting lots of feedback from local DPOs saying, they're trying to knock on the door of the local council and they're going, yeah, all of that equality stuff, very good, but we have to put that aside because, we've got an emergency. And actually, that is the very time that you need to tackle structural inequality, because that's kind of, it's going to manifest itself there as it did. So I think just being really explicit about tackling structural inequality, and I guess it's a wider point, but for us, we really kind of understood that as an equity crew, that is about going beyond just kind of some equality of opportunity approaches, like, well, anybody can kind of access our website and apply, and that if you understand structural inequality, you have to go out and you have to counter that inequality by doing proactive, active work. And I think that this kind of this approach enabled us to start to do that. I think very clearly for us, from that flowed, that commitment to tackle structural inequality, from that flowed for us, and hopefully we managed to communicate that, and I think we did, and I think it landed, at least with some of the funders, the importance and the understanding to prioritise investment in marginalised communities' own organisations and organising. You know, so all of those community grassroots organisations that are run by and for. History shows that really clearly, that it's the self-organisation of oppressed groups that is a catalyst for real change. We absolutely need allies, and we need lots of, lots of other things happening, but communities' own ability to self-organise is absolutely critical. And we were really clear that that's where the kind of priority investment should be. And for us, that's a really big message that I think we're just starting to kind of, hopefully share and absorb. As I said, it's co-production and tackling structural inequality works, including in emergencies. I think also just, we knew it, but it made it clear that we have to, and we're, Inclusion London are at the beginning of this process of really embedding intersectional approaches to funding. So, the impact of the pandemic on disabled people was disproportionate, but within that, the impact of the pandemic on disabled people of colour or disabled women was even more disproportionate, with very specific drivers. And we have to collaborate in that cross-cutting kind of intersectional way. I think it was clear that process really, for us as the equity crew, but hopefully for some funders, maybe Sam can come back, that it really, doing that kind of joint work really did start to it was really informative, and I think we all learned something. And, I attended a couple of the kind of funding panel decisions and decision-making meetings, and it was just fascinating, and getting to see, that decision-making in play, and some of the kind of challenges of making decisions based on kind of, not brilliant data, and it's really, really interesting. And we need to build from that. I think the fund and some other kind of work we did in response to COVID just shows the absolute importance of grassroots kind of community user-led organisations to kind of deliver support, both in an emergency but also in everyday work, and how funders need infrastructure organisations to kind of play a big role in supporting and facilitating that kind of connecting up funding programs with marginalised communities. And yeah, I mean, we'll probably get onto that, but I think this is very much the start of a journey of better collaboration, but I think we've got some really good practice to build from.
Absolutely. I don't know if Sam wants to come back on any of that, but it does sound like there's definitely a lot there which I think we need to build on as funders. I think for me, what I'm interested in is just maybe trying to understand some of the initial challenges potentially that you face as the equity crew or group, however you want to be referred to as. I know from a sort of funding perspective, oftentimes when we have these conversations, particularly around the lack of infrastructure to marginalized groups, it's part of a much broader conversation. But just even how we start to think about, or rather how we embed some of those intersectional approaches. I'm just really interested to just understand some of the challenges that you faced as a group in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there was a challenge internally to work together and to kind of find that consensus. Luckily, as I said, that was really quick and clear about our message about prioritising user-led organisations and moving to kind of, as much as possible, a focus on core funding to support organisations to do what they are doing. So there was a lot of consensus there, and we kind of produced a very, very brief, I guess, initial kind of position paper on that we shared with the LCRF. I think it was the strategy group. So I think some of the challenges with funders, and maybe some of that was a bit online, but I think I would have liked to have seen a bit more kind of maybe in-depth discussion between us and funders. And there was a bit of a sense sometimes of speaking into the void, you know, just kind of talking our bit and not getting much back. And I know that we've got some amazing progressive funders represented here, Trust for London particularly, and CBT, that get it. But, you know, there was lots of other funders there. And I guess I was surprised that we didn't get pushback about some of the questions or some of our approaches. I was a bit worried that we would get it would be seen to get bogged down in this, what does a user-led organisation mean? What's the definition? And we moved from kind of majority run by and for to a higher kind of benchmark. And unless you kind of understand why user-led organisations are so important, my fear was that came across as quite kind of dogmatic and a bit prescriptive. And not many funders were saying, why the hell are, you know, why are you so kind of, you know, focused on this? So I was worried that we didn't have enough chance to really unpack why user-led is so important. So yeah, I suspect there's still funders out there with a lot of questions, some challenging, that probably didn't feel able to challenge. And I guess we need to kind of get to a position where, you know, they can say, they can genuinely do that, and hopefully we will have a response. But that might be the format as well a bit, I think. But we did have some really interesting conversations. And I definitely got some insights about kind of funding practice from this.
Brilliant, thank you, Tracy. And I'm now going to invite Alistair to just share his thoughts and reflections.
Thank you, Hugo. Good to hear from Sam and Tracy as well. Yeah, I mean, just to kick off, and the funding community in London are very aware of this, but social enterprises by their very nature are trading in broken markets, the vast majority of them. So either by place, they're attracted to trading in very poor communities where there's gaps and need, or else their constituent group, it might be ex-offenders or ex-homeless or whatever it may be, there's built-in inefficiencies in their business model due to the vulnerable nature of the people that they're supporting. So they don't have as much of a fighting chance of washing their own face and earning profit as their next door neighbor commercial businesses. And therefore, they're all pretty familiar with running this kind of tightrope between, on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, grant seeking to the traditional funding community, and on a Thursday, Friday, concentrating on, you know, upping their traded revenues and running their business, whether that be B2B or business to business, or B2C, business to consumer. And of course so they're well au fait with how to make that stack up. It's complicated, it's a bit, it's pulling you in two different directions. And then if you layer that with the pandemic, when that kicked in, obviously, because they have a good proportion, in some cases, of traded income, in many instances, that traded income was switched off overnight. And if I think back, I remember, just because we've got so many thousands of people that have been through SSE, and to be honest, the huge bulk being in London, because that's where we started for, you know, we've been going for 25 years. And so my email was just lit up, as I'm sure all of yours were, with people really panicking about the fact that they put, 15 years or 10 years in something or whatever it may be, and it was all going to come to nothing. So accordingly, we and other people in our sector were really hammering on the doors of particularly the lottery and government to say, come on, you need to move quick. What are you going to do? And the lottery, to their credit, were absolutely brilliant and determined to do something, because the whole funding community had for decades really encouraged trading, earning income, entrepreneurship, whether it be B2B or B2C. I mean, partly as a way of finding their own exits from funding situations, but also partly by trying to encourage impact and perpetuity and finding new business models. So they were well aware that they had absolutely been on board with that, and they wanted to stand by those who had validly sort of picked up that mantle and gone for it and amassed traded income and amassed customers, and they knew that that was obviously going to collapse. So, and I remember just having a discussion with one of the senior people from the lottery, and in the kind of worst bits of the beginning, where they were saying, yeah, okay, right, we're really happy to, we've worked with the lottery as a re-grantor for over 10 years, re-granting their money nationally, but millions of pounds a year. So it was an obvious partnership to say, come on, what can we do now and what can we do quickly? But they obviously had a whole lot of other people, our peers in our sector, knocking at their door as well. And what they didn't want to do was set up 5 schemes, so that the social entrepreneurs and social enterprises would have 5 websites to check and look in 5 different places. And so what they were saying was, well, maybe one of you could kind of prime it and take the money, and the other 4 could kind of sit around the table and advise. But I mean, the truth be told, we're competitors one day, we're collaborators and partners the next day, and that flips backwards and forwards. And that's, let's be real about this. That's the truth. I've got to make my institution sustain, so does everyone else. So the idea of kind of sitting as an advisor around the table to another one who was going to take the money and kind of say, oh, Alistair, what's your opinion? And, no, that wasn't going to work. So we had to find some way to level up the power and the equity in the piece. And it was only purely because of London Funders and their Grenfell work, which I was kind of semi-conscious of and aware of in terms of that collaboration, and then the COVID response collaboration. And I was kind of aware that they had done something with technology and a platform, and there was something to do with Bagsying and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't know the detail. And I knew James, who is the chief executive of London Funders, and despite him being pulled in every direction, had chanced my arm and phoned him and said, look, we're trying to nut this problem where we're being told to collaborate by the funder, but the best idea we've got so far is that one of us steps up and takes the huge amount of money, and the other 4 are kind of nodding dogs. And that just wasn't going to work. 4 people, 4 organizations would be upset about that equation. So James was unbelievably generous and just said, look, open book, you're working nationally, you're working with social enterprise, we're not doing that. You can nick the whole lot. And here's my staff, here's emails, here's everything. And, we're happy to sit with you. We're happy to talk you through it. Here's what we learned, here's what we did. And it was just utter generosity. And it fast forwarded us unbelievably. We would never have fathomed it, never. And we wouldn't have had a clue how to do it. And we worked how to do it in weeks. And we had our portal up and running with 5 funding partners behind it. So just to name check the partners that were involved. So it was Key Fund, Resonance, Big Issue Invest, Unlimited, and us. And we knocked together this portal super quick with London Funders' help. And I've got to say, without any payment to London Funders, it was incredible. And then we got this up and running. And to date, bear in mind, this is national, it's not just London. So it's proportionately a lot less money than you were talking about, Sam. But we've brokered 38 million to date to the social enterprise sector, which is desperately, desperately needed. because not only did they lose all their customer base, many of them, but then in kicking out of it, they need to do all this reacquisition of customers thing, which is really complicated. If you've run a cafe, you lost all your customers, you've got to tempt them all back in order to keep coming back. And if you're doing workshops in schools about, I don't know, offending and gangs and that type of thing, you've lost all your school customers, all your contracts, and you've got to go and sell them all again. So the reacquisition bit is complicated for social enterprises as well. So, and I suppose coming out of it, Ugo, it was just brilliant. It took a crisis to smash our heads together and say, you've got to work together. And of course, we're doing it at the end of the day for the social enterprises and for the impact. So it's like, we just, as institutions, we needed to get over ourselves and just get on with it, if you like. And the funders had a bit of power in terms of the lottery did say to us at one point, we want a one-stop shop. We want one place for these people to go. So, fight out between you, but we want one place to go, which is, and we needed that, because otherwise it would be, no, it's too difficult. We'll do 5,
Thank you, Alistair. That's really interesting to hear. And I suppose that's a good segue actually into our discussion. Obviously, your work has brought together many of you name check some of the funders and investors within the sector. I found from my experience, oftentimes many of these, investors or funders have sort of different approaches to how, they fund or measure success in this space. So I guess my question here is, what sort of lessons do you think are there for funders, with the same long-term, longer term aims for the sector, but with different approaches as to how to get there? How can we collaborate for the future? Just building on some of the things you've shared already.
Well, it's a fascinating question, Ugo, because to be honest, if you think back 10, 15 years, I don't think it would have been possible to preserve the innovation and the individual approaches of, in our case, it was 5 organizations, because we didn't have tech as a platform to enable choice and to equalize power. And it was tech that was a breakthrough for us, because in the old days, what we would have had to have done is kind of think, okay, what's an amalgamation of best practice here? And let's kind of, I'll give up this idea that I work on and you give up that, and let's get to a kind of cookie cutter, bog standard offer. But now, because of tech and because of the choice that offers the punter and the choice it offers us as the kind of funders investors behind this screen, we were able to keep specialisms through the piece. And so I think, and that really was on the back of the Grenfell London Funders work and then the COVID recovery work. And so to my mind, tech, and then, was a big breakthrough in terms of how do we equalize choice, power, allow for innovation, allow for difference, and yet have clean and neat ways forward. And of course, the other side of that is how interesting are the learning opportunities at the back of that through the data that's amassed. So for 2 reasons, the pandemic accelerated the use of tech and data, which enabled us to collaborate whilst not collapsing our, long-held sort of innovations and passions, and the sector does need to be vibrant and diverse and allow for difference. And I think it's quite interesting hearing what Tracy was saying as well, because we've had a huge focus on kind of user-led or people lived experience, or, and equalities through the 38 million we've got out the door. And I think tech and data really allowed us to kind of explore that and allow that to pop up in its many and diverse and interesting ways. It might be index of multiple deprivation, it might be, ethnicity, it might be X, Y, or Z. So yeah, I would say tech and data were the real enablers in this, in the speed and agility of the collaborative working.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, just sorry, before I move on to Sam again, just, I mean, you mentioned quite rightly the work that, you know, London funders have done and, you know, have been doing. And it's been sort of 20 months since, I think it was something like 400 funders signed the We Stand with the sector statement. Again, that will be in the chat for anyone who wants to read that, where we sort of committed to working differently to support civil society. And it's been something like 19 months since the first of, I think it was 3,300 grants were given out by 67 funders in the London Community Response Partnership. And so the work, obviously, through the pandemic, as you mentioned, was driven a lot by the learning from funder collaborations, you know, Grenfell Tower, the Manchester Arena bombing, and the Borough Market attack in 2017, all captured in the piece we commissioned from IVA, which was the possible, not the perfect. And so we've been able to obviously build on this learning through COVID-19 with the learning reports that have come out, and, you know, on the collaboration for the future and the Festival of Learning. I guess, again, just thinking about it, as you look to the future, some of the challenges that, you know, social enterprises face, you know, may be different from other parts of civil society. From your perspective, what would you prioritize as the opportunities for funders to collaborate to help to meet, you know, those long-term needs of, in particular, the social enterprise sector?
It's an impressive list of what London funders have achieved, but also the reflection that's gone on. I wonder how they do what they do with so few people. It's incredible. So I'd say something in particular, Ugo. There's something called match trading, which is a way of giving grant that incentivizes trading. So the basic way it works is you offer somebody say a £10,000 grant, but the only way they get it is if they trade £10,000 more than they were previously trading in a year. So effectively, imagine they were trading £20,000 in a coffee shop supporting homeless people back into work, and you say, I'll give you a 10K match traded grant if you manage to lump an additional 10K onto your traded income. And what it does is it acknowledges that they're not trading in a perfect market, that if the fact that they've got 6 homeless people working in their cafe means that there's an efficiency hit, but it doesn't push them down a dependency route. It doesn't say abandon trading and, you know, seek grant. What it says is concentrate on your business, including the blended social impact bit. Concentrate on selling tea and coffee and cake, and we will walk with you through a match trading grant. And we've done that, I don't know, 7 years now, and a whole lot of other funders have collaborated with us on that. So there's about 20 funders around the match trading task force and government. And it's nudge economics, really. It's trying to support people in building a more resilient and sustainable kind of business model in order to produce the social impact in their perpetuity. And that's the big agenda for the social enterprise sector. Rebuilding post-COVID is collaboration around how do they reacquire their customer base, whether it be B2B, B2C. And it's a huge task. And it's slightly off the usual script of trusts and foundations, because usually a trust or foundation picks maybe a place or a theme in terms of the funding priorities, but nobody picks business model, resilience and sustainability. And so it's trying to push them on to slightly different territory to say, you know, please try and factor this into your thinking, maybe as a secondary lens, but it is important to help these people rebuild their business models in order that they can sustain and grow, and ultimately that the funders can get an exit. But that takes both capacity building work, to help them on their journey of, it's pretty brutal commercial capacity building work, but also is dangling carrots. It's nudge economics. It's saying you do your bit and we'll work with you, because otherwise any chief executive of any social enterprises, there's a real bias to seeking grant. The return on investment to filling out a form from a grant funder is, in a day's work, you could get 20 grand effectively bottom line. If you're selling tea, coffee and cake, you'd be lucky if you make 20 grand profit in a year. So there's a natural bias to seek grant. And what we want to do is change the way we administer the necessary medicine of grant in order that it's in line with the trading ambitions of the social enterprises. So that's the big collaboration opportunity going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. And I just want to pick up on that with Sam, but in a slightly sort of different way. I mean, when we think about the kind of foundation for future collaboration to support the sector, oftentimes we talk about the need for funders to collaborate. And we know, obviously, through London Funders that through the London Funders members audit, that there is definitely a strong appetite to collaborate, but collaboration amongst funders can, sometimes be difficult to achieve in practice. So I think, Sam, I guess what I'm saying here is how do we deal really with some of the challenges that come along the way, from your experience, not just through the LCF, but just more broadly, obviously having worked in the sector for quite some time.
Thanks, Ugo. Yeah, that was fascinating, Alistair, to hear about the way that portal was able to be just transposed over and used. It's amazing. Yeah, it is challenging, and it was challenging to collaborate before the crisis, and it will continue to be challenging to collaborate as funders. I think that one of the biggest challenges in terms of getting other funders on board, or even getting internal buy-in as somebody who works at a funder, or maybe as somebody who sits on a board at a funder, or whatever part you're playing within a funder, is around how that you're going to achieve the aims that you're trying to achieve with the collaboration, and what makes it worth doing it as a collaboration, and why not just do it on your own. And during the crisis work, we weren't able to embed some of the learning stuff that would have been a luxury to have done at the front end, because we were focused on pace, and we were focused on getting funding out as quickly as possible and opening the fund within the first few days of lockdown. But I think for collaboration going forward, one of the key things is really about getting those learning questions right at the beginning, at the front end of the collaboration, so that you can measure whether, as a group, you are actually doing what you say that you're doing. So it's great to have the principles. I was talking about the 8 principles of LCR at the beginning. City Bridge Trust is involved in another collaboration called Local Motion with 6 other funders. Most of those are national funders. And we have a similar set of principles, but they really are only worth the paper they're written on, or the screen they appear on, if you then achieve them. Otherwise, what are they doing? So there's something there, and it harks back to what Alistair was saying about data. There's something there about the huge opportunity we have now with data to be able to set principles at the front end and then measure, and I think measure in a live way rather than an afterwards way, because the measuring afterwards is helpful, and it leads to lots of reports. But actually, what we found during the pandemic collaboration was we had like a live data tracker which showed us whether we were actually meeting our aims on funding user-led organisations or not. And so every week the panel would come together and they would look at the data of what they awarded the week before and say, well, we said we were going to prioritise user-led organisations. Did we prioritise them? Are we actually funding them at the rate that we aspire to? So that's something around the way that you plan for the learning and the way that you utilize data in the best way possible. And we also had some great support from the GLA with some of their data people. And again, that was about the power of collaborating in more than just collaborating, getting money out the door, because we were collaborating with our people, the power of our people. They had data people in their team. We've got a data analyst at City Bridge Trust that did some brilliant analysis during and following that work. The second thing I think is about, it's not about the challenge for funders. This is about the challenges that collaboration can lead to for funded organisations, because ultimately they're the reason that we're doing this, and they're the ones who are delivering the work and making the impact in the communities. So if the collaboration works for them, then it's a success, regardless of, not regardless of, but in addition to whether it works for us as funders. And there is a risk with collaborating that you make it, you fix something at the beginning end. For example, we had this great front door, and that's something we can use for the future, and it's been able to be used in other funding situations as well, not just the one that Alistair was speaking about there. I know that there have been other occasions where that system, that portal, has been able to be used. But there is a risk of then creating problems downstream. And one of the things that we heard following the pandemic funding was that organisations were receiving funding, but they didn't know how they were going to be monitored for receiving that funding. And so actually, especially for small organisations, maybe with no paid staff or few paid staff, that could lead to some stress and anxiety, accepting funding and not knowing what you might be asked to feed back on, or what data you should have been collecting or didn't collect, or all of that stuff. So there's something around there in terms of aligning around processes in a forward-thinking way, and in a way that takes into account what will happen further downstream to help reduce the burden for organisations that are receiving money. And related to that, I think also this is an opportunity and a challenge. And this is the idea that we come together to collaborate, usually around a certain funding theme or achieving some particular aim. And that is wonderful. But if we're not taking the opportunity to also align in terms of what funding will be available later down the line, whether that's collaborative or not, we're missing a trick, because we could potentially be creating funding cliff edges, or at the very least, we could potentially not be maximising the impact that we could make as funders by creating an environment where organisations can receive seed funding or pump priming funding, and then other funders can come in and pick up that work as it develops and moves forward. And then the last thing I would say is the other big challenge is always around kind of due diligence and risk appetite. And when you've got multiple funders in the room, you will also always have multiple attitudes to risk and multiple attitudes to due diligence. So getting the work in as early as possible to see how that can be mitigated as much as possible for the benefit of the organisations that are applying, I'd say is another key one. And then just wanted to touch back on something that Tracy said about the work of the equity crew. And I think this applies to kind of co-design work or collaborative work in general, where you're trying to have not just funders around that design table. I totally agree with you, Tracy. It was clear that there were some funders who, and that there always are some funders who are more along the page than others around certain messages, and the message around DDPOs, for example. There are some clear organisations that get that and want to support that, and then it's a learning process for others. There was one thing that I just wanted to mention, which was that following our panel meetings in London Community Response, one of the panel members kind of sought me out after it was all over and we were moving into recovery phase, to let me know that they had changed their mind about funding DPOs and how important it was to fund actual DDPOs that meet the criteria. And it was because of the inclusion of your organisation on the panel, and they had read all the reports. They've been in the sector for a long time. They'd been exposed to the stuff that we all have around that work and around kind of the knowledge and understanding of kind of grassroots organizations and self-organizing, but it was having that shifted power in the decision-making room around the decision-making table that somehow enabled them to fully jump on board and understand it. So I think that really demonstrated to me the power of having of trying to change that dynamic as much as possible. But also it really demonstrated to me that we only scratched the surface, because we made a start around equity and we had our 4 areas that we focused on, you know, particular protected characteristics, but we didn't really scratch the surface on acknowledging the intersectionality that we were trying to achieve, the outcomes around intersectionality that we were trying to achieve, and also acknowledging that you have to think really complexly about how to fund user-led organizations and acknowledge lived experience and co-design properly and authentically and sincerely with communities. So that's another challenge and opportunity, I think, for collaboration going forward that will be much better achieved together than trying to do it one by one, funder by funder.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sam. And I really love the way you framed it around, you know, the challenges, but the opportunities. And I think it's really interesting. And I kind of want to pick up on the last point that you made, which is both an opportunity and a challenge in itself, particularly around the work of the equity group and the shifting of power in the decision making, and just how you acknowledge lived experience and fund user-led organizations. But actually, I want to shift this question to Tracy. And I guess just picking up on what Sam said, it's interesting that, you know, as funders, so it's 2 questions actually. So one is that, you know, as funders, many kind of recognize the need to make their grants more equitable, and obviously collaborated with Inclusion London and other equity infrastructure organizations to achieve this during the pandemic. One, where do you see this work going in the future? That's kind of the first question. The second question, again, is just picking up some of the points Sam made. So as a deaf and disabled people's organization, one thing Sam talked about was, you know, some of the challenges around process, and just even talking about some of the processes, particularly around data management and sharing of data. For you, what do you want to see from a longer term funder collaboration, and what do you think are some of the additional processes and practices that funders can change to better support deaf and disabled people? So that's 2 questions.
Thanks, Ugo. Thank God I've got some kind of written question down in advance. Thanks for that. They're really, really interesting questions. I mean, I think taking the last bit first, in terms of kind of funder processes and practices in our space as kind of user-led deaf and disabled people's organisations, I think we absolutely need more and more funders to have an in-depth rights and social model and kind of social model justice understanding of disability. I think there is still that kind of the dominant kind of medicalised, charitable, dare I say, and I know in a way that's a kind of belly of the beast, but approach to disability. And I think that's seen in the fact that the kind of dominant model of kind of funding in this space is funding just disability work with no questions asked, no data collected on whether the organisation they're giving money to fund disability work is actually run by disabled people. And that wouldn't be the case in other equality strands, thank God, and rightly so, but it still is in our space. And I think that is a reflection of still how kind of dominant a non-rights-based, non-social model thinking is about disability and disabled people. And I think something quite deep, probably quite unexamined about maybe disabled people can't really run their own organisations, and kind of linked to this idea of disabled people being kind of passive recipients primarily. So I think we need that change. So we want funders to kind of really explicitly undertake programs of training and engagement with DPOs to really understand kind of disability equality, from a rights-based social model perspective, because so much flows from that, whether it's about understanding the barriers, the practical barriers that might exclude a group from applying, to, how you, the kind of funding programs that you choose to fund. And I think one of the interesting things in that panel, and it was great to get that feedback, Sam, about that one funder, is actually, I think, a question now to ask, and I'm getting a bit more, I guess, confident about maybe starting to say this, is if you're not funding user-led, rights-based disability kind of interventions, then you might be doing active harm. It's not a neutral position where you fund a bit of spicy work with user-led organisations, but you carry on with your traditional funding of people that want to do good things for disabled people. I mean, actually, I think if you're not coming from that rights-based kind of, people leading the change themselves, then you could be actively doing harm. And I think that's something to digest and have a challenging conversation about. So I think, as touched upon, we need funders don't work together. It's still the exception that kind of proves the norm. And I think we need so much more of that. And I think really tackling things like, how do we work intersectionally without kind of turning everything into kind of generic fudge, which is always a challenge, can only be done, as Sam said, kind of collaboratively. None of us have got the answers, but we need to kind of really explicitly work on that issue. I think, just keeping going with that, funding user-led organisations as a priority. And I would say stop funding organisations that don't have an intention to become kind of user-led. And some really interesting things, I think, in our sector, I guess in the 2000s and the last kind of 20 years, there was this kind of push to kind of service delivery. And now under austerity, and we've done a recent report that just shows how many DPOs are kind of trapped in really underfunded, really poor kind of transactional kind of contract funding arrangements that aren't funding the work that does transform communities and transform people's lives. And there is no money, time, or capacity for DPOs to come together to do that policy work, that voice work, that capacity building. So really starting to look at practice like that, if funders are funding equity organisations, whatever they're funding, whether it's like an advice service, I would like to have a conversation about them funding an additional percentage that enables that organisation to take what they're dealing with day in, day out, and be able to influence policy and influence decision makers, because there's still such a massive divide between, say, running an advice service, which is an absolute goldmine of kind of data, and data can be amazing at shifting things, but it gets stuck there because there's no capacity to then turn that into data that can be used to influence. So I think I think there's really lots of interesting questions about how to kind of develop funder practice that really understands we're hollowed out, and we need a range of interventions to help us kind of really bring about that transformative change. Ugo, I don't know if I've answered all of them. I don't know if there was another question.
You have. I just kind of want to, and this is actually to all of you, and I'll come back again. And I'm just picking up a kind of a point / question within the Q&A, and it's really around the role of trust. And what someone has said here is, clearly there are obviously some really excellent relationships built, and you've talked about how do we really develop this kind of funder practice. how do we, the question here is really, how do we hold on to that trust, and how do we avoid, I talked earlier on about the kind of push and pull, you know, and kind of going back to old ways of doing things. And similarly, this question here is, you know, how do we avoid switching into those old power structures and those hierarchies for the longer term? You know, I'll kind of push that to you, and then I'll invite Sam and Ali to just comment really quickly on that.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I think that kind of inertia of switching to default working is so, it's kind of so powerful, coupled with we are all so incredibly busy. I mean, the reality is that the equity crew has hardly met since this process finished, and that's not through not wanting to, it's just simply that there is not that resource or capacity to do that. So we've got really basic capacity issues to deal with. And I think that work, collaboration, needs to be funded and resourced. I think it always helps if it's got a very clear goal, like coming together to look at, you know, tackling intersectionality, how can we really embed that, or whether it's about looking at developing that kind of funded practice in relation to user-led organisations. I'd love to see some specific collaborations on some of those kind of big questions, which, you know, are live, and some of the most pressing conversations, whether we're in an emergency or not. And you know, the need, that the kind of impact of the cost of living crisis is as big as a pandemic on many of our communities. And, you know, that's an emergency, if that helps to kind of frame it in that way. So I think it needs time and resources, and really kind of specific co-produced goals that we work with as a starting point, because otherwise I think it's not going to happen, or it will happen in very kind of minor ad hoc ways.
Thank you, Tracy. If I can just bring in Ali, Alistair, just on that question, just around the role of trust, and in addition to that, kind of baking as well, you know, another point someone was raised, I think the two are almost interchangeable, around generosity as well. That, you know, seems to be a theme obviously coming through. And you know, how do we hold on to that sense of generosity that, you know, we experience as funders during the pandemic, particularly around the collaboration where, you know, it wasn't about egos, it wasn't about, you know, any individual organization. Ali, if I can just invite you to just comment really quickly on that question.
Sure. I mean, I think the generosity thing, it because we all had to play together nicely during the pandemic, it outed who was generous and how they played. And so now it's very quick for me. I can pick up the phone. I know all the people who played nicely and were super generous, and we've got good trusting relationships. And I just think it's really taught the sector a lesson. And I'd be amazed if it rolled back. I mean, it might roll back a bit, but the truth of the matter is, if we continue to collaborate, you know, we'll get more done. There'll be a bigger cake for everyone. And I mean, so in a personal capacity, you know, organizations like, for instance, London Funders were incredibly generous to us when we needed it. You know, I won't rest until I find a way to repay that, you know. And it's kind of like karma, isn't it? You just, you know, you've got to behave in a way that you want people to behave to you. So you're going to find and look for ways to do that. And I do think the whole chapter of the book of COVID has, you know, we're able to easily spot people who are up for that change in working practice. And now they're only a phone call away or an email away. And we've just got to, as a group, hold on to that and find, I mean, funders particularly have got to find clever ways of constantly sewing that into grant criteria and encouraging it, and thinking about the data opportunities in the back of it and tech opportunities. Just, I think it's about sewing in little bits and bobs all the way through everything to encourage that type of approach.
Thank you, Alistair. And just before you comment, Sam, I guess what's also interesting as part of this is just thinking about when is a good time to collaborate. I think you kind of touched on some of that, Alistair. And is there a moment when it feels like you know, working individually is a much better option? You know, are there sort of lessons, specific lessons that we can draw on during, obviously, that, you know, we've experienced during the pandemic to help us kind of think about that, where it's actually makes sense to work individually, and when, how do we really know when is a good time to? I think Sam, you know, kind of touched on this, and she talked about potentially doing that around themes, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, collaboration really kind of suits the status quo in terms of structures of power. So you mentioned in my biog at the beginning, Ugo, the whole notion of tonic, which is this LGBT elder care facility. You know, you've got to quickly push it into collaboration. But at the beginning, when, I mean, me and a few kind of mates who started that way back when, you know, the sector wasn't ready for that. No one's ready for that. You know, you've got to always leave room for mavericks and for new power structures to come in and mix things up. And if everything is nailed down to collaboration, partnership, and joint working, and committees and big rooms of people and consultations, these mavericks won't get in, and the power structure won't change. So unfortunately, I think the answer is we've got to do both. We've got to leave spaces for new voices to come in, and value the maverick nature of those and the innovative nature of those. These are often people, we work with them, and they can't, you know, they wouldn't behave properly around a webinar like this, you know, not that we do, I hope, but they really wouldn't. And we've got to find ways for those voices to come to the fore in London. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably strands of work. We go like, you know, there might be a collaboration strand of a funder, and then there might be something around, you know, it could be social entrepreneurship or any similar type of innovation strand or user-led strand or whatever, just to try and mix things up a bit, because I do think that is important, what you're saying. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. Sam?
Thanks, Ugo. I'm going to answer the other question a little bit, and maybe answer the second question a bit more. But I wanted to go back to your question, which was about how do we not fall back into those old ways of working, and how do we kind of maintain that trust? I think that the first thing that comes to my mind when I think in a really big picture way about how did we do it and what made it work, it was and it is, I think, about leadership. It's about good leadership within civil society, within funders. And for me, the hallmark of what worked, and also the hallmark, and I have observed occasions where collaboration hasn't worked or where things haven't come to fruition. Of course, not everything ever always works out, but it's where that leadership is a low ego leadership. I've noticed that leads to the best type of collaboration. So I think we need more of the low ego stuff within funding, and some of that was forced by the pandemic, which I think made it work a bit better. I think it's about relationships within the funding sector, because it's those relationships and those connections that make this stuff happen. It's about individual human beings talking to individual human beings. So I think there's an onus on us to continue to create and to create new and transform new relationships and connections within the funding sector to create the environment for us to collaborate more and better in the future. I also think there's something here around having shared infrastructure in our in our sector, because for a long time we've had these siloed infrastructure bodies within funding and within civil society, and now we've got, you know, organisations like CAST and Catalyst emerging, where we know, which is the digital network model, and that's you know, you can't fund that in silo as a funder. We, you know, all of the funders of CAST and Catalyst, we're funding it together. It's a network model, and we're really built into that network. When it's not funder funded, it's a shared infrastructure between all of the organisations involved. We need, I think, more of that across different sectors, and by collaborating over shared infrastructure, we then create that collaborative environment more broadly as funders. And then I think the other thing is, it's really easy to talk about more trusting relationships and not having hierarchy and all of those things as ways to create collaboration for funders. But I think we probably haven't done enough examining when we've actually done it and learning from when we've actually done it, because otherwise there's a risk of just talking and talking and talking, but never actually noticing the times when it's working and what we can learn from them, and what was a challenge and what didn't learn and what we got wrong, and that kind of failing forward idea. And then in terms of when is the right moment, I don't really know what the answer is to that. I think that's why it's so important for us to have organisations like London Funders to be able to maintain that neutral role and maintain that position of, you know, having a little bit of an oversight across the piece to spot opportunities. You know, the pandemic definitely showed us that it's possible to collaborate even when it's almost the worst possible time, in a way, because everyone was under so much pressure. People in the funding organisations were affected by the pandemic just like they were in other organisations. You know, people had to do homeschooling. People who are from communities of colour within the funding sector were disproportionately impacted, just like they were across the rest of the sector. So, you know, it did show us that we can do it and that it's worth it. But I think we're probably still unpicking a bit the how did we know it was that was what we needed to collaborate around. So yeah, but I mean, we funded 61% of the organisations we funded during London Community Response we had never funded before. They'd never received a grant from us. So it was really, really it needed to happen, and it was really worth it.
So just to pick up on that, so for funders who are on the fence about sort of long-term collaborations, what would you say to convince them that it's the right thing to do? I mean, in addition, obviously, to all the things you've said.
So I would say that as the first one. It's a way to reach deeply into communities that you haven't been able to reach for one reason or another. I think also there was a couple of bits of learning from the social investment consultancies learning report, and they did the equity learning report for London Funders, for London Community Response. One of them was that they were able to see through the data that they did analyse that funders were funding more user-led groups and more of the not the usual suspects during the course of that funding than they had before. And also they were able to see that there was some reduction in the rate of rejections that was specifically due to the outreach work that the equity partners had done. So we know that those elements worked, and we just need to do it more to really unpick that more and for it to become part of the new normal way of working as funders, I think.
Brilliant. And you can find more of the learning that was captured that Sam has just mentioned. It's in the chat, so do pick up on that. I'm just mindful of time, and I guess to kind of summarize, it'll be useful to just think about, you know, from each of you, one lesson, one action that we can all take away from this as funders. And if there are three things, or I've said one lesson, one action, but rather three things that, you know, you could keep from how funders collaborated during the pandemic for the future, what would they be? Who wants? Oh, sorry, I didn't assign anyone. Who wants to kick off?
I'll go. I mean, for me, it would be speed, low bureaucracy, and kind of this I can't decide whether to pick generosity or kind of tech and data, but something that's 5 for you, Hugo.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alistair. Tracy?
Yeah, I think kind of 3 things. Pooled funding. You know, I think because of that, it really did kind of reduce the bureaucracy and just made the intervention, you know, just the impact was so much more. So much more of that. And I think it is still kind of rarer than it should be. You know, we need more pool funding. And yeah, explicit commitment to tackle structural inequality is absolutely key. And really kind of designing that in from the outset. And of course, I would say this, but kind of really working long term with user-led organisations, both kind of grassroots, but also infrastructure organisations, to really build up that trust and that long-term relationship. I'm slightly kind of concerned that, you know, we might get into a situation where funders start funding like DPOs and go, and there's some expectation that we have to kind of prove our worth in this kind of next funding round to justify them funding us. And I think that they're all kind of, I guess, kind of assumptions flying around, and we need to kind of really build up close working over time together to look at that, because our sector, I'll be really frank, needs lots of investment, because we've been hollowed out, and that's challenging, and there's no quick fixes. But together, you know, we can do something. But yeah, we need to have a kind of mature, kind of as much as possible, non-hierarchical relationship.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tracy. And Sam?
Yeah, so I think my 3 things, because I don't want to repeat too much what Tracy and Alistair have already said. My number 1 thing is a repeating of something that I've already said, and that is the low ego leadership. I think we need to treasure that and try and keep it and emulate it as much as possible as we go forward. The second thing, being able to be really bold with prioritization. We had to do that because of pace, but we should keep that because it worked really well. And the third thing, it sort of touched actually a little bit on what Alistair said, but it's about data. It's about utilizing data to the absolute maximum that we can, really capitalizing on inventive ways of using data to help us collaborate, and also using it to help us share outside of the funding and the money part of the funding, because there's so much more that we can collaborate on outside of that, and data and kind of tech can help us do that.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really useful to hear from all of you. So that kind of brings us to the end. I guess I just kind of want to end off with saying, I mean, you know, when I think about this, and obviously sitting as a funder, as well as a chair of an organization that's, you know, in receipt of funding, it's interesting when I think about the sector's response to the pandemic. And I think what it has shown, it's definitely shown the sector at its best. What's striking, I think, for me is not just the scale of the capital that was committed during the time, but it's also how it was being given, the kind of the record, the speed, you know, with fewer conditions, in greater collaborations with others. So what it showed was that, you know, confronted obviously with the kind of global pandemic, as funders, you know, we've been responsive, engaged, nimble. And so, as I said earlier on, the challenge, you know, and the opportunity, and as Sam, you know, alluded to as well, will be how do we make those features stick? The gravitational pull towards old ways of working will always be strong, I think. As I've mentioned, you know, we're now obviously facing new challenges, you know, cost of living crisis, the kind of economic downturn on some even trust and foundations endowments. But many of those practices that have emerged during the pandemic, and some of you have already talked about some of them, you know, in terms of reducing the burden on grantees, accelerating the pace, you know, and the volume of giving, investing more in local communities, and user-led organizations, low ego leadership. I think it's really important to kind of highlight these things and, you know, think about how we expand and we formalize them. So, you know, that said, it's been a pleasure to host this webinar. As I said, I think it's been recorded, so you can have access to this afterwards. Thank you all for your time. Thank you to our lovely panel. Really lovely to see all of you, to meet some of you for the first time and to see some of you again. No doubt we will connect in different ways. But thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hugo.
Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for the great sharing, Hugo. And nice to
Thank
see
you.
you, Tracy and Alistair. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.